first match of the evening. We've got Tuivasa and Marcin Tybura. I could just let you guys know off the rip. Two guys that I've had a pretty decent read on in their UFC career. Does that mean I'm right every time? Certainly not. But I have made profit betting on both these fighters. That's something that I'm proud of. Tuivasa, one of my favorite bets ever. 5 units at plus 170 against Derek Lewis. I'm willing to find out when you've got a matchup in the heavyweight division, big plus money tag, two guys that are both basically, power punchers, right? That's what they bring to the table. I thought that the difference in that matchup was the durability of Tuivasa, and he was able to go out there, take huge shots from Derek Lewis, and then find his finishing shot in the second round there. Great sweat. I posted the video earlier on Twitter this week. It was one of my favorite bets to sweat of all time. But on the other side here, Marcin Tybura, he's kind of been a low-key guy, right? People don't think of Marcin Tybura as a elite heavyweight, in my opinion. I think people kind of view him as a guy that has a very clear athletic ceiling. But he's also a pain in the ass, right? He goes out there and just finds ways to scrape wins. He's almost always an underdog. And Marcin Tybura has overperformed expectations in the UFC pretty considerably. So let's go back and take a look here at the previous betting history for these guys. So for Marcin Tybura, I could tell you guys, I almost got a little bit lucky, so to speak, when you talk about Marcin Tybura against Alexander Romanov. Now, did I make a bad bet? No, I think I made a very good bet. I bet pretty significantly 2.2 units on Marcin Tybura plus 350 against Alexander Romanov. And when you looked at that spot, the reason I bet it was because I didn't think Romanov had the cardio to push for the full 15 minutes. So I was like, man, maybe he goes out there and crushes Tybura. But Romanov is typically a submission guy, right? He's not typically a guy that goes out there and ground and pounds people to a finish. He could do that. That's in his repertoire. But most of the time, that's not really what he's looking for. He likes to get on top. He likes to wrestle. And so I was like, if you want to wrestle with Tybura, it just seemed to me like a guy that could keep that pace, keep that energy, keep going on and making his game, reliant on rounds 2 and 3. But that's what he did in that spot. Now, could it have been ruled a draw? I think absolutely that could have been a fight that went to a draw, right? I thought in round 1, it was nearly a 10-8 for Romanov, if not a 10-8. He was on top. He was dominating. He landed a lot of ground and pound shots. Some referees might have even intervened, stopped the fight. But Marcin Tybura showed if you don't close the show on him, if you don't put him away, he's a tough guy. He's going to try and work his way back into the fight. He's going to try and get his own wrestling going. He can keep that pace for 15 minutes. So I do think that we've seen some interesting looks over time from Marcin Tybura. Sometimes his chin looks completely sketchy, right? Let's just go through his results outside of the betting context, and we'll talk about the fact that he's 3-2 over his last 5 fights. He lost to Tom Aspinall. That's the heavyweight champion. You can give him a pass for losing that one. He lost to Alexander Volkov. That's a common opponent between these guys, but the difference is Volkov just shut down the game of Tybura. He was not able to finish Tybura. He was not able to overwhelm him or implement his skill set. But what he did do was shut down his wrestling, guys. He just prevented, I think, 13, 14 takedowns. This is off the top of my head, but I remember watching the fight. Marcin Tybura tried to wrestle. He tried to grapple. He tried to force that on Volkov, and unfortunately for him, he was not able to do so. But what's interesting is that Volkov was able to go out there and absolutely devastate Tuivasa on the mat in his last fight. Talking about the good results I've had betting Tuivasa, I'll tell you about the bad results I've had betting Tuivasa. I bet him at plus 420 against Ciryl Gane. Was that really a bad bet? I don't know, because I do think plus 420 in the heavyweight division, it's hard to cover that number, right? And I also had small positions on the fight not to go the distance, as well as Ciryl Gane via submission in that spot. So I felt like I tried to cover a bunch of different bases on that matchup. And I did get paid on the fight not to go the distance, right? They had a war. There was 2 knockdowns, right? One for Tuivasa, one for Ciryl Gane in that matchup. So it seemed to me like a decent enough spot there, plus 420 on Tuivasa. Hey, I'd probably take that one again if they ran it again. But Ciryl Gane, clearly the better fighter. I did pick him to win the fight. And I think that if he had implemented his ground game, we've now seen more examples of guys that have taken Tuivasa to the ground and given him a real problem. Sergey Spivak did it back in the day before people really knew who Sergey Spivak was in this heavyweight division. He took him down. He repeatedly mat returned him. He eventually exhausted Tuivasa, and he was able to get the finish in that spot. So when you look at a guy like Marcin Tybura, what is the obvious game plan for Tybura coming into this fight? Wrestle, 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 try and get on top of this guy. That is clearly where he struggles. When you look at the other side of things, what is the clear game plan for a guy like Tai Tuivasa coming into a fight with Marcin Tybura. Try and replicate the game plan that a lot of guys have had success with. Tom Aspinall knocked him out in the first round. Augusto Sakai, who is not a very good UFC fighter, with all due respect, a guy who had kind of struggled to maintain his roster spot, he gets knocked out in the very first round. Shamil Abdurakhimov, a guy who has struggled to find success recently. He's a little bit older, a little bit longer in the tooth. He was able to knock out Marcin Tybura as well. This is back in 2019. So since 2019, the only finished loss for Marcin Tybura is very reasonable against Tom Aspinall. However, we go back in time. We see Derek Lewis knocked him out in the third round. So there has been multiple examples of Marcin Tybura getting hurt, getting clipped, getting finished, and that extends all the way back to M1. He has a doctor stoppage loss in the third round. So you look, and Marcin Tybura has like a clear flaw with his game, which is just that he's not the most athletic, he's not the most durable, and this is heavyweight fighting. If you're not the most durable, you might pull a Jailton Almeida on me and go out there, look good in the first round, but then not be able to take the big shots that land in round two, right? Heavyweight, the margin of error, very small. You make one mistake, you go out there and you're not careful, you have one bad exchange, it could just be the end of the fight, right? And a lot of times at flyweight, 135, you make a mistake, you recover, right? You get hit, you get clipped, you could find a way back into the fight. But that's not always the case at heavyweight, right? It could be one mistake and the fight is over shortly thereafter. So when you look at Tai Tuivasa, you look at the fact he's on a 3-fight skid, and he's favored to win the fight. That does feel a little bit odd and a little bit suggestive to me. But it's also a guy you have to understand is going to come in here with 8-9 times the social media following. He is a very popular guy. He's a very well-known guy. He's being featured on WWE programming and this and that. Tai Tuivasa is a known commodity. People like him and they want to support him. They want to root for him, right? I think that we've seen now a couple times when you send Tai Tuivasa into a high-pressure situation in front of his home fans in Perth, in front of his home fans in Western Australia, that hasn't always played out, right? I actually think he's 0-2 in Perth in the UFC. I could be wrong about that. There could be other examples I'm not thinking of, but I believe that Sergey Spivak fight was one that took place in Perth and he got dominated and defeated in that one, submitted in that one. The same thing happened to him, unfortunately, guys, against Alexander Volkov, right? Volkov is a guy that is maybe not known for his wrestling and his grappling and his ability to go out there and push that pace. But I do think he's a brown belt, if not a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He has been training for quite some time. He's a big, long guy, 7 foot tall. And he was able to get on top of he was able to get on top of Tai Tuivasa and give him a lot of problems on the mat. I had bet Tai Tuivasa at plus 200 or so in that spot. And I said after the fight, that was a bad bet, even at the number, because Volkov appeared to have him covered on the feet, right? He looked to be the better striker. We've now seen guys that can go out there and kick can really give Tai Tuivasa problems. They can put shots in his gut. We saw that from Ciryl Gane. We also saw that in the fight with Volkov. So guys that are lengthy, that can hit him from far away, that can target the body, that can make him work, those can be real problems for Tai Tuivasa. And on top of that, we've talked about the notable glaring weaknesses on the floor. Now let's talk about some things that are X factors, right? Some things that could potentially matter in this matchup that might not matter in every matchup. We're seeing a guy in Tai Tuivasa who looks to have incurred several injuries over the course of a difficult MMA career. And when you're carrying around a lot of weight, it can be difficult for your body sometimes to hold up. The rigors of wrestling, guys, it's not like a lot of these other sports. You go out there and you want to box, you want to have this fun. It can be brutal, right? You can get hurt, but the training is a lot different. You hear guys that are professional MMA fighters and professional boxers talking about it. The training camps for a mixed martial arts fight are brutal. They're very hard to get through, much less to get through healthy. So when you're talking about a guy in Tai Tuivasa who doesn't necessarily have, these great physical attributes, he is a guy that I think is a little bit injury prone, especially trying to work the wrestling, trying to work the grappling. If that's not your forte, if that's not something you have a deep background in, you could just make more subtle mistakes in terms of body positioning, body control. And when you're moving around 250 pounds, 265 pounds, 280 pounds, that's just not something that's easy to do safely, no matter what, right? You could be a very good grappler, you could be a very good wrestler and still get hurt. It's a hard thing to do and not expose yourself to injuries. So when we're looking at the fact that this guy in December has footage of Tuivasa, on the ground, holding his knee, limping out of the gym, that's not that long ago. There's footage from a few weeks back at WWE events, my man's out there chugging beers and having a great time. Nothing wrong with that, right? From a fan standpoint, from a, hey, I like the guy. He's a cool, likable guy. It's heavyweight. Maybe you don't have to make that limit. But when we're talking about betting hard-earned money on elite professional athletes, it's kind of hard to justify betting on somebody that I've seen injured. It's kind of hard to bet on somebody that's on a 3-fight skid, that their confidence could be a little bit shaken. It's kind of hard to bet on somebody when they're, not taking it as seriously as you might hope outside the cage when they're drinking alcohol, right? If you've seen CJ Stroud, it's like a big viral moment. He's on the show with a couple of comedians. The comedians coming in talking about, hey, drink my alcohol and this and that. And he's like, no, man, I don't do that. That's not how I get down. CJ Stroud is trying to be an elite professional athlete. He's trying to be very disciplined with what he puts into his body. Is that the case with Tai Tuivasa? Do you think he's counting his meals? Do you think that we're seeing him, weigh out his pieces of chicken to make sure that he's having the right amount of protein? These guys are 145. These guys are 155. That's what they have to do to make it to these fights, to make the weight class. They have to be very professional. I just don't know that Tai Tuivasa, a guy I really like and respect, is very professional at this game. Let's talk about something else that's an X factor that I don't know that most people will discuss this week. He's business partners and he's family members, I believe, through marriage with Tyson Pedro. If you guys remember, Tyson Pedro, he's had a good UFC career overall, but it's kind of been start-stop. He's dealt with a lot of injuries. He's dealt with a lot of things outside the cage, and he's developing this business, called Drink West. So this is a company that's had relationships business-wise with the UFC. I think the UFC likes Tai Tuivasa. I think they even like, to some extent, Tyson Pedro. But what did Tyson Pedro just do after his last fight, guys? He retired. He said, hey, I'm not making enough money doing this. I can't really justify all the time I spend doing this away from my family when I don't make enough money from this. And I have other business ventures. I have other opportunities in life. Maybe I should just move the hell on, right? Maybe I'll come back one day, but right now, it just doesn't make sense for me. It doesn't make sense for my family. When I look at Tai Tuivasa, is it impossible that he does something like that after this fight? I don't think that it is, right? And I can't bet on somebody if I have that concern, even a touch in the back of my mind, because the truth is Tai Tuivasa, fun guy, banger, but he's got a beer company. He's an entertaining guy. I think he could go talk. I think he could, entertain people in a variety of ways. I don't know that he needs to put his body and his health on the line constantly to do that, right? I think people would just as much rather watch a Tai Tuivasa hit somebody over the head in the WWE with a chair and then pour back a couple of brewskis. That's just the reality of the situation as I see it. So could I be dead wrong? Absolutely. Do I think the line is a little bit weird and suggestive that Tuivasa could win because he's coming off a 3-fight skid, just like Petr Yan, right? Coming off a 3-fight skid, and then he goes out there, finds a way to win as the favorite, chalked out in a big situation. Yeah. But here's the other thing, right? When I look at a guy like Petr Yan, what's the difference there? Number one, he's a UFC champion, right? He's a guy that won the world title. So you have to give him some credit and respect. Then you have to look, did Petr Yan start getting finished all of a sudden? Did he start not taking his fight seriously? Did he have glaring weaknesses in his game? No, I didn't see any of those things, right? So do I regret not betting Petr Yan last weekend? Yeah, I kind of do, because there was a lot of things I saw that suggested to me from a market dynamic standpoint that he should win the fight. But I had exposure elsewhere. I didn't want to overexpose on the card. Ended up not working out for me anyways. But it's one of the frustrating things sometimes about picking your spots when you're betting, is that I had some good reads last week that I didn't end up betting on. When I'm looking at the card, do I want to force action on a guy like Tai Tuivasa, who I've loved betting on in the underdog category in the past? I can't justify, I don't think, betting on him in this position right now at chalk. Let's go ahead and take a look at the betting results for Tai Tuivasa as a chalk favorite in the UFC. Shout out to betmma.tips. I track myself here, third party. It's interesting to note, right? 6-2 is Tai Tuivasa as a UFC favorite for a 25.1% ROI. That's impressive stuff, and I can honestly say that's not necessarily what I expected to see. But let's also talk about the fact that the last time that we saw Tai Tuivasa favored in a UFC fight, it was against Augusto Sakai, who's a common opponent. He knocked out Augusto Sakai in the first round. Augusto Sakai knocked out Marcin Tybura in the first round. Interesting. Perhaps that's contributing to the betting line. Also, the last time he was favored before that, guys, was against Greg Hardy, right? A guy who's no longer with the promotion. a guy who I described as a white belt on bottom, with all due respect to the man. It's just like, he looked like a guy who had never been underneath somebody. When Marcin Tybura took his ass down, my man was looking up at him like he had just seen God. It was a very, very bad look, I thought, for Greg Hardy in that spot. So you look at these guys, and they both have had mixed results against, the same kind of level of competition. That's what heavyweight fighting is, right? Sometimes these guys just lose fights against guys they're better than. I think Marcin Tybura, overall, skill for skill, is a better fighter than Augusto Sakai. But timing is everything in mixed martial arts as well. When you look at Augusto Sakai, he had kind of been on a run. He had won a bunch of fights. He had some momentum. So let's go ahead and look at the time that they fought. Marcin Tybura and Augusto Sakai. What was Augusto Sakai doing at the time? So Augusto Sakai, when he fought Marcin Tybura, was on a 4-fight win streak. He had never been finished in professional mixed martial arts. When he fought Tai Tuivasa, on the other hand, guys, he had just been in a 5-round brutal war with Alistair Overeem where he got beat up, he got beat to shreds, and he eventually got finished in that 5th round of a hard fight. Jairzinho Rozenstruik then put him in a body bag in the very first round. So when you look, those are a couple of things that you got to take in the back of your mind here. Is like, timing is everything in mixed martial arts. Did this guy, Augusto Sakai, just fall off a cliff? I think he kind of did, because his confidence was a little bit shaken. He got beat up over 5 rounds in a fight that would have been a huge one for his career if he could have got that win over Alistair Overeem. And then instead, he gets back-to-back knockout losses against Jairzinho Rozenstruik, another heavy-handed guy. Then they throw him in there with Tuivasa. Are you going to have the confidence? Are you going to have the same bravado that you had against Marcin Tybura? The answer, in my opinion, is no. So it is a very fascinating matchup. I don't think this is an easy one to call, but I have said to a lot of people when they've asked my opinion on this fight, I think Tai Tuivasa is a guy who's fine to bet at plus money, because he goes out there, he fights hard for your money. He's going to go out there and give you a good show. He's going to try and knock people out. But the injury concerns, I think, are huge for me here. I want to make sure that this is a guy that's healthy, active, wants to be here, wants to continue his career, and wants to move forward. But I had made the note on Twitter a while ago. I retweeted this. I'll retweet it again so people can see this throughout the week. But I had noted very long time ago, who's the most overranked fighter in some of these divisions, right? When we were talking about Wonderboy Thompson and the fact that maybe he was a little overranked at 170 pounds, it was a popular topic of conversation in the MMA world a little whiles back. I said to myself, who are the most overranked guys across divisions? And one of the guys that stood out to me was Tai Tuivasa. At the time, he was ranked number 3. And I was like, man, I could pick 5, 8 guys behind him that could beat him in this heavyweight division, no problem. So when I look at that, it's kind of been borne out by the recent results. It's kind of been, brought back to earth a little bit. Tai Tuivasa, fun guy, banger, puts on the fun shows. But is he really a top 3 guy in this heavyweight division? I think it's hard to say. And the last thing I'll leave you guys with on this matchup is, when you're talking about laying chalk, the things I like to know is that the guy's going to have multiple paths to victory. I was dead wrong about Jailton Almeida last week, but when I wrote up my preview, guys, what I had said was, I think he's alive to win the fight by out wrestling him to a decision. I think he's alive to win the fight via KO or TKO, because we've seen Blades taken out before. His durability hasn't always checked out. And I said, lastly, I thought he could win the fight by submission. That's 3 paths to victory. That's what I want to see. Did it work out? No, it did not. But at the time, he was minus 105, right? He ends up closing minus 145, minus 150. Those are the kind of things that you look for in fighters. You're trying to ascertain, do they have multiple paths to victory? Can they put it together different ways? I had thought that Benoit Saint Denis had multiple paths to victory. Did I think he was going to win a decision? Not really. I just didn't think the fight was going to go to a decision, right? I thought that those guys, Dustin Poirier is a guy that likes to fight towards that under. But what we ended up seeing was he maybe didn't have the same power, the ability to knock out Dustin Poirier that Dustin Poirier clearly had in reverse. So that's something that I live with some regret, right? It's just thinking to myself that he had more pass than he did have. And he slowed down a little bit over the course of that fight. So again, am I trying to, linger on last week? No, because every matchup's new. Every fight card is new. But what I am trying to do is learn the lessons, right? If you're going to make a bad bet, if you're going to lose a bet, you got to at least try and learn the lessons and ascertain, what you get right and what you get wrong. Shout out to Joseph. He says he had 10 units on Dustin. God bless you for it, man. It was a great bet. In hindsight, especially the plus money. Hey, I can't even fault you for it, right? I did bet Benoit Saint Denis, to be very clear, for just 1.3 units, minus 130. I bet it months back. closed minus 225. But that's the reason that you can never count your eggs before they hatch in this game. There are no CLV trophies, right? Nobody's going to call you up and say, hey, man, that bet was fantastic. It just is a reality of the fight game. So what I always say is if you're going to get something wrong, try and get the best of the number, right? Because the truth is when you get things right in this game, if you can get the best of the number, you're going to win more money. If you get things wrong in this game, you want to get the best number possible so that way you lose as little money as possible each time you get something wrong. That's the principles. That's the fundamentals that we're looking for from a long-term betting standpoint. So to close out this matchup and to finish our thoughts on this main event, I think it's well matched. I think both these guys have a clear chance to win the fight. I think there's path to victories for both guys. But for me, I do think it's a dog or pass situation based on the broad narratives of this fight, coming in at heavyweight, coming in with some potential injuries on the Tuivasa side. I would be shocked if he was a better wrestler and grappler overall than somebody like Marcin Tybura. I don't know that I could trust his takedown defense. So for those reasons, I think that Tai Tuivasa live to win the fight by knockout, absolutely, certainly true. But I don't know how many paths to victory he has outside of the knockout. And so I'd have to cap him, pretty substantially to win this fight by knockout in order, to get behind him.